When we think of Bristol and we say the word Black history, the first thing that comes to mind is usually the transatlantic slave trade. But I wanted to start before that. What do we know about Black people in the site where Bristol is now and the region before the transatlantic slave trade kicked off? Who wants to take it first? David?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you. It's wonderful to be here and to be able to talk in my hometown and about my hometown. The story of Bristol is the same as the story of Britain, which is there is a Black history before the Atlantic slave trade. Now, given that Black history didn't exist just 50 years ago, it had been completely expunged from the national story, the fact that we have any of it is the result of two generations of historians, community activists, archivists, students, and local Black communities. So obviously the first thing people uncovered was the Atlantic slave trade, because that's the biggest, deepest thumbprint. But it's only really been in the past sort of 10, 20 years that people have been studying what happened in Britain, what the Black presence was before the Atlantic slave trade. And Bristol is part of that story, but it's fragmented. We know very, very little. We have people pop up in the records and then they disappear again. But there is now no question that there was a Black population in Britain in the 16th century, in the Tudor era, which Britain had a very brief slave trade in the 1560s. But those people who ended up in Britain, in Bristol and other places, weren't connected really to the slave trade. They were people who had been connected to Britain really through just the level of movement that was happening in the 16th century in the Renaissance. A lot of the people that we know about came via the Iberian Peninsula, Spain or Portugal, which had lots of contact. They were the first people to get to the coast of Africa. So there is Black history before slavery. We absolutely know that. And I think in some ways the real question is, why are there still people in the end of the first quarter of the 21st century who are threatened by that idea? What amazes me is not that this history keeps revealing these forgotten Black people from different parts of British history, but that when I write about that or speak about that, there are people who need to try to stamp on that history, need to try to discredit that history. And, the arguments they use are just, they're paper thin. And in some ways, the arguments aren't interesting. What's interesting is, why is this seen as an attack on our shared history rather than part of our shared history?
You guys can do an applause, not after every question, but we'll just pretend it's there. I want to go to you next, Lawrence, and obviously David come in on this as well, but I'm going to say briefly, because we could be here all day, all year, an entire lifetime talking about this. What role did Bristol play in that subsequent trade of millions of Africans?
Well, I think if you know anything about Bristol's history, it was instrumental in the creation of what is known as the transatlantic slave trade. We'd rather say the transatlantic slave trade in enslaved people, to put some humanity into that story. And I think the earliest person recorded from Bristol was a gentleman, a Bristol merchant named William de Font, who first exchanged enslaved Africans with the Portuguese back in 1480. So when you look at the history books, how what's been presented, often it comes up into the middle of the 1600s. But actually, Bristol merchants were involved in this much earlier than a lot is shown. And this was because they were chasing the sugar roots that the Portuguese were taking over to South America, and they were trying to get involved in that. And then Bristol's history, why it's so stamped on and why it doesn't want to be recognized, its involvement, because it was so involved and so much was built on that. And then we actually have institutions and people to this present day that profited from that period in time. And that's why often Bristol's very good at telling you a half-truth, not telling the whole story. And it wants to tell you the story that's palatable for the city of Bristol. And that, in a sense, is what led up until the 7th of June 2020, when the statue got pulled down and thrown. And there were so many people that believed that that was a statue of Bristol's most virtuous son, but didn't understand any of the history of how he created his wealth. So this continues, and this is the importance of having independent writers, independent filmmakers, independent musicians and artists who can tell a story. Because one thing that still goes on in Bristol today, and is still very prevalent, is that a lot of research, writings and stories told come through academia or come through certain places where it's government and public funding that does it. So what happens in Bristol is, if you do any story that's going to rock the boat or create waves, that money that could be coming to your institution can stop. And something I'd like to add to this was going on all the way up until, I say this, 2022. A directive came out from government catching up in the culture wars, that said to all institutions that are getting government money, if you suddenly start supporting artists or certain projects that could damage brand Britannia or are looking to support Black Lives Matter, we will withdraw your money. And that went to all the major institutions in the country to
go woke, go broke was the threat. I mean, governments aren't supposed to threaten cultural institutions, but that is what they do.
And that's what came out. And one thing I share with you all today. So, and we got caught in that. So, quick little story. I hope Chaz don't mind. But we were about to get a huge grant through Historic England, through some of the stories that we were telling. And it's to the final point of being signed off. And the week that it was meant to get signed off, that directive came out. And then 2 weeks later, we ended up having never put it back with result, and the whole thing was withdrawn. And it's because of this directive that came out. So culture wars is a real thing. That's it.
You mentioned Edward Colston there, and obviously, or Colston, so you can tell I'm from down south. Edward Colston there, and he's always brought up time and time again, but there's more to Bristol's slaving story than Edward Colston, right, David?
I mean, the irony, I don't feel sorry for Edward Colston, but I mean, if you were going to have any sympathy for him, is he's not very important. And he's got very little to do with Bristol. He is a Bristol-born London slave trader who then spends the money he makes through his involvement in this evil trade in his home city. He spends most of his life in Mortlake and Surrey. He is not really very Bristol. He's certainly not a wise and virtuous son of the city, as the statue, which is at the heart of this story, pretended that he was. And in some ways, the great irony of the story of Edward Colston is that he is at the center of the Royal Africa Company, the company founded by the Stuart monarchs, Charles II, James II, to kind of break in, get England really in the center of the Atlantic slave trade. Remember, you will have seen this in the coronation of the king last year. Most of the stuff in the coronation is after the 17th century. And that's because when Cromwell and the Commonwealth took place, they destroyed it all. They melted it all down, all of those medieval crowns and other objects. The Stuarts came back and they had no money. And in some ways, the Atlantic slave trade was the crypto of the 1660s. It's what you got into to get rich quick. They created these monopoly companies, and that meant that nobody else could trade in enslaved Africans. And that monopoly was in London. So Bristol just wasn't allowed. Bristol wasn't permitted to take part in the slave trade. So for Colston to be a slave trader, he could only do it because he was in London. He was in the center of power with the backing of the royal family. And that age, which ends in the early years of the 18th century, the age of the monopoly, the age of the Royal Africa Company, that is the period when that company transports into slavery, we think, around 150,000 people. We presume 20% of them died in the bellies of those slave ships. That's what Colston's involved in. And the irony is that it is the failure of that company, partly the failure of Colston, that allows Bristol its moment in the sun. The Bristol traders are the interlopers. They're breaking into this monopoly. When the monopoly of the company is withdrawn in 1712, Bristol rushes in to fill the vacuum. And there is a brief period, 1730s, 1740s, before the rise of Liverpool, when this city is not involved in the Atlantic slave trade. It's the most important slave trading city in the British Empire. And, we know the statistics, thanks to David Eltis and the slave ship voyage database. 2,114 ships left from those docks, and between them, they carried into slavery 500,000 human beings, which is about the population of Bristol today. And if you wander around Bristol and you look at events like this where people have gathered, you just imagine you can feel what 500,000 people looks like. This small city in the west of England transported into slavery 500,000 people, and around the world, in North America, in South America, in the Caribbean, are millions of people today who are the descendants of people carried on Bristol ships. There's a place in Barbados called Speightstown, and its nickname is Little Bristol because it was so connected to this city. So I think even now, Lawrence is talking about doublethink and half-truths. As long as I've been in Bristol, which is more than 20 years, I think there's this determination in some quarters to cling on to this idea that it was really Liverpool, really London, maybe it was really Glasgow, and we were a kind of small player. That is to minimize something which this city would be stronger and better and healthier and more united if it could confront. Bristol is deeply, profoundly involved in the Atlantic slave trade.
Oh, have a clap. Go on. That's a treat. when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, deliberately it's made to seem something that is distant geographically. But there was a black presence in Bristol during the entire period of enslavement. So what were the lives like of the black people who were here in Bristol? You know, what was their status? Where do they live? What kind of roles were they employed in?
I was going to say, a lot of this is still what is not being recorded. It hasn't been, because they didn't want its involvement to be shown. So a lot of stuff hasn't been recorded, hasn't been written down to act as if none of it actually happened. So there's definitely a presence here of people of labour, labour providers and workers in the city all through this period. But if you look to find note of it anywhere, it's nearly impossible. David?
I mean, the nature, to describe the trade, you have to describe human beings as property. And it's a really uncomfortable way of speaking, so forgive me for that. But there are two ways in which enslaved people found themselves in cities like Bristol, mainly in the 18th century. One is that people who were slave owners, plantation owners, or even plantation managers in the Caribbean, no one went to the Caribbean to settle down, because you have a 50-50 chance of dying of tropical diseases. The slave traders, the estate managers are the new rich. They're people on the make. They're not the elite. They're not the aristocracy. They want to make some money and then come back to Britain and buy into the aristocracy. So they're not trying to stay there for their whole lives. And the moment they've made enough money, they've got estates, they can hand them over to managers, they come home. And they bring with them their portable property. And in a world in which human beings are made into commodities, that means human property. And they tend to bring back with them enslaved servants, usually, not always, men, very often young boys. And we know about them. You know, Pero Jones and Pero Bridge was one of them. I made a series for the BBC called A House Through Time. We went to a house near the docks on Guinea Street. I mean, it's called Guinea Street for a reason, because of the Guinea trade, which is the slave trade. And in that house lived an enslaved man who escaped. And, you know, sometimes I'm walking around the streets of the older parts of Bristol, and I remember there were people, enslaved people, running on those streets, being hunted on the streets that we walk. This was a game of life and death, of cat and mouse. They're trying to get to the docks. They're trying to get on a ship. They're trying to become a pirate. That's the one way of getting out of Bristol if you're an enslaved person. Join a pirate crew. So people were brought back as servants. There was a fashion, a really disgusting, really disturbing fashion for enslaved boys. When people try to pretend that there's been no black people in Britain, one of the great problems of that is art. There are hundreds of British paintings that show enslaved black servants, usually boys, because it was the most fashionable thing you could have. It was the most fashionable commodity you could own, an enslaved black child. And you wanted to show off your wealth, your worldliness, the fact that you were connected to this exciting Atlantic world by having your portrait painted with your enslaved child. And some of those paintings are enslaved people from Bristol. There was one other way that people came here. Slave ship captains were allowed a bonus. And the bonus was to bring back one or two so-called, sorry, this is horrible language, privileged Negroes. That was the phrase they used. Your bonus was you could bring back an enslaved person and sell them on the docks in cities like Bristol. And we know, because we now have over 900 advertisements for the sale of black people on the street, by the docks, in pubs, and for the return of captured, escaped black people. We know people lived in Bristol in forms of enslavement. Now, some of them may have been living closer to being a servant, but some of them certainly were enslaved. They were regarded not legally, they were regarded as property. The law was incredibly complicated and a total mess. But I think the most powerful thing is to remember, one of those moments when history and geography collide. This didn't happen in some imaginary textbook, Bristol. This happened on the streets that we walk, the cobbles in those old streets by the docks. People ran for their lives from slavery on those streets, slipped on those cobbles. Bristol is this stage in which these dramas, this horror played out. And it's, we should, the past should catch up with us every now and then. We should have a chill down the spine. Terrible things happened on our streets, not in the Caribbean, not just in the Middle Passage, but here.
I just wanted to jump in on the one thing about the art, and it's something that you can all go back and have a look at. It was deemed as just so culturally great to have the images, and you'd have them elegantly dressed, But a lot of these enslaved individuals in that pictures would be furniture. So you'd have them stood there holding a light. There'd be the lampshade and other things. And when you go and check this, that is what they were being used to do. And this was seen as a great achievement to be able to show that you had an enslaved black man or black boy in your living room as furniture. That was how much the dehumanization of these individuals was to a level. Yeah. So I just wanted to add that to the bit.
And you get into the kind of the weird psycho mess of slavery is that an enslaved person who ran away was guilty of theft because they'd stolen themselves. I mean, just, it's so warped. The mentality, the ideas you have to hold in your mind if you decide a human being is an object, that to escape from slavery is to engage at the same time in an act of theft of your own body. That's how warped this system, this is how it distorted the mindset and the thinking and the morality of millions of people.
Sorry, I just got to add, because to really get your head around the idea of property, the reason why they were made property, that meant they were no longer a human being. So that means you could destroy your own property. So that wasn't murder. I could throw you on a fire and burn you in my garden, but I've just burned a chair. Because it's property, it's not a human being. So murder was being committed across the board, but nobody was being charged for murder because the individuals had been dehumanized to the fact that they were now classed as property. And this was made legal, was it through the slave code, which was introduced later?
Yeah, the Barbados Slave Code of 1661, which is copied and repeated in the North American colonies, in Jamaica and the other colonies. It absolutely created a distinction between white people, and it used the word servants, and it used the word slaves. And what it really meant was black and white. And we see, as those slave codes evolve and metastasize across the Caribbean and North America, how what they begin to create is the idea of a binary society. Now, Hilary Beckles, who's the great historian of Barbados, which is the laboratory in which the British invent slavery, he's very clear that Barbados and what happened there in the 17th century is something new in all of history because of the British obsession with law. And so many good things came out of the English common law. So many things of how we define ourselves as people came from the law. But that obsession from the law meant that the English, unlike anybody else, needed to create a legal framework for slavery. And to read those laws, as Lawrence said, is to see the legal dehumanization of people. As Lawrence said, though they stipulated the punishments that were legal, that if an enslaved person, and this is written down. This is not interpretation. This is written down. If an enslaved person ran away, you could cut their cheeks open. People would put razors there and cut people's cheeks. You could remove their ears. You could cut off people's noses. I think there's things that happened in slavery that we imagine are kind of medieval. We're talking about the 18th century, the age of enlightenment. And there are, medieval historians get annoyed when I use this term, but there are kind of medieval punishments taking place on plantations owned by people who walk the streets of this city just 4,000 miles away in Barbados. And again, if you create a system in which you have to believe that people are not human beings, you need some really powerful idea to convince somebody that that child is not a child, that woman is not a woman, and that idea is called race.
I feel like in the mainstream, over the past few years, there's been much more attention, rightly now, paid to the stories of, the black enslaved Africans. And then we've had a lot of attention paid to their descendants who came to the UK as part of the Commonwealth migration, hundreds of years later. But there's a huge gap in the middle. So what are the stories, the missing stories of black people in Bristol post-abolition? Like, what do we know about the black presence in Bristol then?
Well, in some ways, Bristol's presence is the same as Liverpool's and Cardiff's and Glasgow's, as it was a port town. And it was, by its nature, kind of hyper-global. People from all over the world were coming here. We know there were Sierra Leoneans coming here. There were people who were coming because they're part of the Royal Navy. If you think about a third of the Navy, the merchant Navy at certain points were Africans. They were from Liberia, some from Sierra Leone, Nigerians. So Bristol had this kind of churn of these communities that were mixed race, as did Liverpool, Cardiff, Glasgow, the other port towns. But the other thing that's happening, of course, and this is the other thing we forget, is there's a strong desire to get to 1838, 1st of August, the end of enslavement in the Caribbean, and go, that's the end of the story. Everything's fine. We don't need to feel bad from this point onwards. Enslavement meant people went from being human property to being in abject poverty. It went from people being in torture to being in destitution. And there is a kind of story, which we often forget, about the fact that the Caribbean was the most neglected part of the British Empire. My auntie, when I was growing up, my British auntie, went to Jamaica to set up schools in St. Thomas in the east, the poorest part of Jamaica. She went to set up schools in the 1970s because from 1838 up until independence in the 60s, Britain never produced enough schools to educate the children of Jamaica. Now, Jamaica today has one of the most astonishing education systems. By some metrics, it's ahead of Britain. Jamaica did that. That's not the legacy of empire. When people want to say, look at the wonderful things the empire left behind, there was not a university in the Caribbean at the end of independence. Jamaica couldn't educate its own children. The neglect. We went from obsession and extraction to neglect and dismissal. And the great high watermark of that is the Morant Bay Rebellion in 1865, when poor Jamaicans, desperate for some land to prove that they could be industrious, to prove the stereotypes about black indolence, black lack of industry, black lack of entrepreneurialism, to prove that they were lies. They petitioned Queen Victoria, said, can we rent land, grow crops, pay back the debt, to show that we are capable? And they were dismissed. A letter was sent, not written by the Queen, but one of her advisors, which I think is, in a strong field, one of the most patronizing things in the whole story of the British Empire. And Marvin, our former mayor, his ancestor was hanged in the Morant Bay Rebellion when black people in Jamaica rose up against that system. It stands up alongside the Indian Mutiny and the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, the Amritsar massacre, as one of the great crimes of the British Empire. So there's this terrible age of neglect. And that's one of the reasons why Jamaicans and Barbadians are on boats. That's why they're in Panama. That's why they're in and out of the docks of Liverpool and Bristol and other cities, because they're from islands that has no economic plan for them, no ambitions for them, no belief in them.
I just want to add, there's a piece of that whole history that's missing. So we talk about abolition. They say 1807, they say 1834. But there's all the uprisings. Like some of this was forced upon the colonizers to address a problem they seen coming at them very quickly. Yeah, so they don't talk about the Haitian Revolution. 13 years, and they defeated their enslavers, and really that became the first. Yeah, the British, the French, and that became truly the first free nation that abolished slavery. But we're talking about what Britain did. But we don't talk about that there were hundreds of uprisings throughout this whole period of time, and also the brutal life expectancies for a couple of the islands, where Haiti, the life expectancy, someone going there was 4 years from being put onto the island, and in Jamaica it was 7. But what that enabled, was that people kept knowing who they were. They weren't just breeding and producing enslaved, broken individuals. They are people that are coming from Africa, and it starts to happen. They are the two countries that really forced abolition through their uprisings.
I want to pull back as well. Let's zoom back into Bristol and look at 20th century migration and also the black presence in the 20th century in Bristol. Because we've talked a lot about, the horror of the slave trade, the horror of the racialized society that emerged from that. But on the flip side, what's been the influence of black people on Bristol, modern Bristol today? How have they shaped this city, both physically and culturally? Do you want to start, Lawrence?
I'll give it. Well, I've grown up in Bristol. So I'm 55. I've been here 50 years. I grew up in the inner city. And really Bristol sells a very good brochure where it go look at diversity and inclusion. But this is a seriously divided city, very segregated city. And growing up, it really was. And funny enough, it's funny because where we're sat looking at the buildings, I know we got the river just below, but also whose event this is. Massive Attack grew up before it was Wild Bunch. And the reason why the Bristol music scene is known, because a lot of us couldn't get into Bristol clubs. There was a door policy that we weren't allowed access. And for our parents, when they went into the city, they'd be attacked. So the place of safety at that time became St. Paul's. And that became the center for the African Caribbean community. And the music scene grew up from there. But this was because we couldn't enter the city. So you'd have places, Shabeens or Blues, and then you'd have the street parties and the sound systems. And that's what's given birth to this, because of the racism they found here. So you had people invited here in the post-war migration. You know, where it's sold to come to England, everything will be rosy. We've got jobs for you, streets paved with gold, etc., etc. But when they came here, the exclusion they faced was incredible. And the reason why St. Paul's was where they were housed at that time, it'd been cleared with people moving to outer estates, but also it was the most bombed part of the city. It was just pure destitution and dereliction, the whole place. But you'd have families of 6 living in one house, 4 children sleeping in the bed. It was the one place where they could live. So, but the contribution from these workers that worked, and that's what they came in for work, and they did a lot of jobs that other people weren't prepared to do. And then we came to what became the bus boycott. But what the city wasn't prepared to do, and this is something that makes me laugh currently, is they could clean the bus station, but they couldn't drive the bus. They couldn't be a bus conductor because they didn't want blacks touching whites. And I can't remember his name now, who was running the bus service at the time, but he directly said that we will not employ blacks because we don't want, and that was legal. But in Bath, they were. In London, they were. In Birmingham, they were. But Bristol, no. So Bristol at the moment, you'll hear a lot of it coming around that it celebrates being a city of protest. And it's like, oh, celebrate, we're a city of protest. No, you're a city of protest because of the segregation that you had in it, because of the racism that you had here, and people had to fight for their rights to be seen as one and equal. And that comes all the way up into the present day. So black people in this city from post-war have contributed so much to the city, but that recognition has often been minimized.
I think that's entirely right. I guess my hope is, though, that there is a Bristol that looks at those events, you know, with pride as well as awareness of the causes behind disturbances and riots and resistance, rather than just the poster of, you know, celebrating it. You know, I have to think about what happened 3 weekends ago. I was up in Edinburgh yesterday and with another Bristolian, Carol Vorderman, who was giving a speech in the Edinburgh TV Festival. And the interviewer said, we should be really proud of what happened in Walthamstow. And Carol said, no, we should be proud of what happened in Bristol. Bristol and Brighton are the cities that took to the street in the long, proud British tradition of fighting fascists. And it was young Bristol people who did what people did in the civil rights movement. They put their bodies on the line. The police weren't there, for 20 minutes?
Yeah, about 20 minutes.
And we were talking about what would you do as I know this question's coming later, but...
No, this question's coming now. We're doing it now.
If you're going to do
we're doing it live.
A Black History tour of Bristol, you have to add the Mercure Hotel into that list now. And, you know, I have just nothing but respect and admiration for those young people who, you know, didn't hold a placard. They took blows to defend the traumatized kids and men and women in that hotel. So I have a lot of hope, but Lawrence is absolutely right. I remember getting shouted at a few years ago for saying this to a colleague in television. You know, Bristol's the most divided city I've ever lived in, and I used to live in Virginia. You know, and I don't say that lightly. I don't say it, you know, to be controversial. It's just say it because that's my experience. In terms of socioeconomic class and race, we have a massive segregation problem in this city. And I think that speaks to a history. It speaks to a history of racism. It also speaks to a history of social engineering that was determined to destroy those white communities in St. Philip's, in Redcliffe, and put people in atomized estates that they then underfunded, didn't produce the roads, didn't produce the swimming pools, the libraries for those people. Talking about people being warehoused, I think Bristol has a bad history of that. That atomization of peripheral estates of Bristol has been part of a story that's led to other forms of segregation.
I just want to ask as well, obviously we are using the term black to cover a lot of different demographics that live in Bristol. There's a huge new East African community, right? Is their experience different to the experience of the Afro-Caribbeans and the West African migration that came on? What is the experience of the different black demographics in Bristol?
Oh, well, I can't say I'm informed fully to talk on my Somalian community in Bristol, but what I have seen through them coming here, they've come here with really high values and high standards of living. And due to a lot of their exclusion, you can see that a lot of the problems their young men particularly are facing, starting to get drawn into gang culture for protection, are very similar things that the African-Caribbean community can, because they still find themselves excluded from mainstream society here in Bristol. And so Bristol still has this huge problem. But just one thing, I want to go back to the Mercure Hotel. That's what I want to say so quickly. So we were there on Saturday. And on that Saturday, as a counter-protest against the people coming to protest against asylum seekers, refugees, and the anger and violence which those protesters came with into the city was unimaginable. It was ridiculous. But the young people that were there knew that they were going to go to the Merca Hotel because it was said. And when they left Castle Park, they marched. They marched round to the Merca Hotel to protect it, as said, and they linked arm in arm. And for 20 minutes, they came under a horrendous assault, and they didn't falter. And they stood there and they stood firm. And I think it really needs to be recognised. I think everybody here should raise a hand for those young people, yeah, for what they did. Yeah, because they showed the best of humanity. They showed what we can be. Yeah, and they stood tall and firm. And I know that they were frightened. And I know some of them are here now today. And I know that. Yeah, but they were scared, but they stood there. So the following Wednesday has got a lot of the accolades because there was 2,500 people, 3,000 people in Old Market. And good, because you came out. But those few, yeah, one day they will represent the many.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I just wanted to just put that there to say, well done, thank you.
David, you put the Mercury Hotel as your key spot in a Bristol Black History tour. Lawrence, if I was saying, take me to one location that you think tells a particular story about Bristol's Black history, where would it be?
I know people are just going to say, oh, that's so obvious. But it's going to be St. Paul's. St. Paul's, when I was growing up, it was that oasis of love and safety. That's what it was. You could get chased through the city in different places, things could happen, but you could cross Brigstock Road if you're coming from the city, and you'd step across Brigstock Road, and all of a sudden, there would be an ease that would fall over your body because you would be safe. And I'm talking about the police. The police would hunt us when we were kids growing up. They'd chase us for any reason, but they would even stop. And then we also, at certain times, there were a few roads in St. Paul's that the police couldn't go. Yeah, they couldn't go onto certain roads. And that's where you suddenly reside to feel safe. Let alone the love of the families, the community spirit. It's one place that felt normal. And then when you look at what St. Paul's has offered through culture and through art and how many individuals have come from that community that have delivered so much everywhere, it has to be St. Paul's. Yeah.
What a great note to end on. Can we have a massive thank you for David and Lawrence?